I hear a lot of complaints in the comic book industry regarding the writing, and as a professional writer with 25 years experience, I can pretty much understand people's issues with the writing of comics. And one of the big problems with the way comics are written is that we have comic fans writing comics. And while on the surface that may seem like a good thing, from a professional standpoint, it's a very bad thing to have a fan writing a favorite character. And the reason why it's bad for a fan to be writing a favorite character is because they're coming at that character from an emotional perspective. And when you approach a character from an emotional perspective, it's a very biased view of the character. And in that view, you're not really assessing a character's internal strengths, internal weaknesses from an objective perspective. Because when you come from an objective perspective, you have a very balanced view of things. But when you come from an emotional perspective, you see the character from a fan's point of view, which is they're always perfect, they're always right, they're always cool, but you don't see how to tell stories with them. When you come from an objective perspective, like a professional writer does, you're seeing telling your story, and your story is the most important thing. And the most important part of your story is the message that you're trying to convey. And in a lot of today's comics, the message is pretty much getting lost these days because a lot of writers are too emotionally involved and they don't understand that a story is ultimately a comment on society or has a message that people want to tell. It's just not, guys in tights saving the world, but the reasons why they're doing this. And this is, paramount in your comic. But in today's comic medium, again, we have a lot of writers who love the characters, but they love the characters too much and they're too emotionally involved. And when you're writing characters, and this is something I had to learn, the hard way over the last 15, 16 years about characters, is that you have to pull some distance between yourself and the character. If you don't put that distance between yourself and the character, you'll never be able to see them from an objective perspective and come to understand what mistakes that you're making. And you will in some many cases start favoring characters and putting them to the forefront, and your story is going to get lost. And this is what I'm seeing in a lot of modern comics today, is that a lot of times these characters are always put to the forefront, and it's good to put a character to. They're supposed to be the main focus, but the message of the character is getting lost. The mission is getting lost, and because the guy is a comic fan, he's coming at it from a fanboy's perspective or a fangirl's perspective, and that's not a good perspective to come from. What you really want to do is focus on your message, focus on your themes, and we're not seeing that message and themes being focused on because everybody's just so emotional. And when you approach characters emotionally, you're not seeing them, all of them, and you can't really present them in a multidimensional perspective. And this is just something I have been seeing with a lot of writers. That they like the character, they love the characters, and that's all well and good. But you have to approach these characters, from a professional standpoint, and you have to approach them with an idea and a mission of telling a story effectively. And I'm not seeing stories being told effectively because everybody is so emotional regarding your favorite superhero, and they see their favorite superhero from that comic fan perspective. They love this costume, they love these ideas, but that's not practical when you're trying to tell a story. When you're trying to tell a story, what's the most important thing is, you know, your theme and your message at the end of the story. And that's usually what your writer focuses on, is the message that they're trying to tell. And I don't see a lot of messages in today's comics. I see a lot of writers, they're coming at things with emotion. They're planning these big fights and all this stuff, and they're having heroes fighting heroes because they don't really know how to tell a story with a villain. And that's another big issue that I see, with people who are emotionally involved. They don't know how, again, to tell a balanced story, because the bad guy is a critical element to your superhero paradigm, and it's always been a part of the superhero paradigm ever since the Pulp Fiction era. Back in the 30s, because the Pulp Fiction was the predecessor to your comic book, and they always had bad guys in there, and you always need these bad guys. And I'm finding in many comics, because a lot of these guys are emotionally involved, they can't really craft villains, and they can't really develop plots that involve villains, so they have to resort to heroes fighting heroes, or heroes sitting around having long expository sequences where they're sitting in the house. And in some cases, I'm seeing characters being turned into Mary Stews and Gary Stews, such as your Batman. These characters have gone from having, balanced and normal lives where they had time for friends and family and work, to Batman sitting in a Batcave training and prepping 24 hours a day to go out at night. And that's just a totally unbalanced version of the character. It's almost borderline Asperger's esque. That he always goes into, he's just obsessed with fighting crime. And yes, he created, when I read the first Batman comic, he has a mission to take on criminals, but he is not to the point where he's pretty much living to be Batman. He's just, that's part of his life. It's about part of understanding superheroes, understanding they live a balanced life. They have careers, they have a personal life. They're almost like a volunteer. Their superhero duties are like volunteer work. It's something you do in your off time, or whenever you have time to do it. If you have and they usually work cases on the side in addition to their careers. Now, that's all part of the story paradigm, but many writers today just don't understand what balanced stories are, and that you do need characters to have that social life, even to establish plot points, or to, develop scenes, and even just to present some balance to the character so that the reader can relate to and identify with them. And we're not seeing that with these emotional writers, because again, emotional writers, they just see things one way. They see things from a very slanted perspective. They don't really understand, the models of storytelling. Yes, they've read a lot of the comics, but they haven't done, a lot of the research into the character. When you're writing a character, or even creating a character, you have to do a lot of research to find out if these elements that you're creating will eventually fit, and allow you to tell an effective story, and if this character is even viable from a perspective. Because a lot of times when you're young and you're creating, because I remember in my 20s creating characters, and a lot of them I had to wind up putting on the shelf, because yes, they were nice, they had nice visual designs, but they didn't have any depth, or ability. Had no ability to turn them into anything multidimensional, because yeah, the power was interesting, but there was no way to convey that to the reader in a way that effectively in a story. When you're writing characters, you need more than just a costume. This is something I learned, hard way. We're reading many 90s comics right now. You need more than a costume. You need more than a gimmick. You need a personality. You need a voice. And you need to be able to utilize other elements in stories, such as your supporting cast. And I noticed that is also lost in many comics. You don't really get to see the supporting cast that often. But the supporting cast is very important, because, again, it adds balance to the character's life, and it allows us to identify and relate with this character, and also allows us to see, a nice contrast to the hero, because the hero needs regular people in their world so that they can be special and stand out. And you don't see that anymore. Oftentimes, we see a lot of these heroes, they're just sitting around brooding and being angry, and that's not what a superhero is. I mean, being a superhero is only a part of their life, and we're not seeing that, because, again, when you're emotional, you only want to see the superhero. You don't want to see the other aspects of their life, and then you don't even understand how all of these elements really relate to the story or the paradigm. When you really get into comic storytelling, and just even basic storytelling, you start understanding about how all these elements work within this three-act paradigm to create a effective story. Because when I was studying comics as a form of storytelling, just reading Stan Lee and other creators and their pointed views on different things, I started to understand the three-act paradigm, and that's what you really see in a basic three-issue comic story arc. The first act, usually introduces the alter egos problem, which usually parallels the what creates the bad guy, and that conflict, leads up to eventually in the first issue the confrontation with the bad guy. Usually bad guy usually wins in that first issue, and then the second issue, leads to the second plot point where the hero, starts to try to solve his alter ego's problem, and then has another confrontation with the bad guy, and then that leads to him figuring out the weakness, which is plot point two, and then everything usually builds up to the conclusion where the hero defeats the villain. Then that's usually, done in the third issue, and that's usually your basic 3 issue arc. It's very similar to your screenplay and its 3 acts, which is, has its elements. Every story usually has a paradigm, and these models, they are time tested and they always work, and you just have to understand how they work. And I learned, how they worked from reading comics, taking a look at pulps, and then even taking a look at serialized movies like your Durango Kids, and other serialized movies, and seeing that they all follow the same model for storytelling. And you have to understand those models in order to write in them. I mean, each format is different. Your novel is different because it's a more of a prose model. Your screenplay uses the fewest amount of words to create the biggest pictures. And your comic creates pictures, but with panels. And you have to understand how all of them work, from a craft standpoint and a creative standpoint. And when you're emotionally involved, yes, you've learned many of the technical elements, but the execution usually falls flat because, again, the emotional involvement is what prevents you from seeing things objectively. Yes, what people really mistake emotional involvement for is passion, and passion means you care, but you understand you want to create the best product possible. An emotional person just wants to create stuff, but they don't understand, the mechanics of how it works, the nuances of how it works, and how to tell stories in that medium. They learn some parts of it, but they don't really understand the techniques and how things work, and how every story in a comic model, superhero comic model, directly affects another story. And then they wind up making, emotional decisions like killing characters because they become creatively frustrated, or they have these long, 100 issue stories that pretty much turn readers away because, again, they just are emotionally involved, but they don't have the technical craft to understand how to make these elements work effectively. A comic is a form of storytelling, and you have to learn how to effectively tell stories with that medium. And a lot of guys just don't know how to do it. Yes, they love the characters, but they have not learned the craft effectively enough. And that's what's leading to so many bad comics these days, at the big two, Marvel and DC. I see a lot of the indies. A lot of guys are getting it right, and they're coming at it with that passion, but they're also coming at it with craft, and they have, learned how to effectively put their stories together, and they've learned how to work within story models, and learning how to work with the paradigms that are time tested. And this is what I'm seeing. I mean, you have to learn how to take your emotions out of a story, and effectively, in order to be an effective creator, you have to learn how to put some distance between yourself and your characters. Yes, you love your characters, you care about your characters, they mean a lot to you, but you want to give them the best story possible. And the only way for you to give them the best story possible is to pull yourself away as a writer from, the action, so you can see it from a panoramic view. Because what I see with a lot of writers today is that they see things from a close-up view, and because they're too close, they can't see the mistakes that they're making. When you see things from a panoramic view, you can see all the action going on, and then long term, you can see how the actions in one story can directly relate to another story, and how you can actually take some of those elements and plot points from that old story and then use it to create a new story. And that's something that you learn when you start to get a little bit better in your craft. And a lot of guys, they're just not learning the craft effectively. I also think it's due to editors who don't have enough experience, and they just don't know how to teach, because again, they didn't learn craft. Because I really believe that the 1990s were the worst thing that ever happened to comics creatively, because a lot of people, they just learned this really, really bad sense of craft, and it just, a lot of that it continues to trickle down Thankfully, what I'm seeing now in the 2010s, as it relates to the comic medium, I'm seeing a lot of great talent come up, and I'm seeing a lot of guys, they're going back to the old traditional models, and we're seeing, you know, a lot of the craft starting to come back. It's very slow, but it's in the indies, not in the Marvel and the DC. It's really in the indies. Seeing a lot of the craft come back. I'm seeing more, when as it comes down to the art, more proportioned bodies. I'm seeing a lot more structure when it comes to the stories, and I'm seeing a lot of people, following the paradigm. Yes, they're being quite creative with their stories and their story ideas, but they understand how the model works, and the stories are a lot tighter, and things are coming together a lot better. And I just don't see it at the big two, but I do see it in the indie market. And I see that, there's a corner that was turned from the 90s, from the gimmicks and the shock and, the emotional, let's jerk people's emotions, and we're going back to craft, and that's a good thing. And I really believe that we really need to get comics, superhero comics especially, out of this whole emotional writing stage, because I see a lot of comics that are being published by your big two these days. It's mostly emotion, and it's the reason why nothing ever, never, really readers don't connect with anything is because it's all emotional, and it's not, organic. It's not coming from the story, and it's not about a message in the story. It's all just some guy literally creating fanfic and publishing it and telling us that it's a comic. And that's what I'm seeing. A lot of glorified fan fiction at the big two, but in the indies I'm seeing a lot of creativity and originality. And that's why I'm urging people to go out and go get indie comics, instead of, your Supermans and your Batmans, where these characters have literally been turned into Mary Sues and Gary Stews for writers. And because I just see so much emotional writing, and emotional writing is the worst thing of all, because all it is feeling, but with no structure, no form. It doesn't fit within a model, and you're missing out on great literary elements like your irony and your foreshadowing and your symbolism. All of that stuff gets lost in an emotion with an emotional writer. An emotional writer can't tell you a story. All they're giving you is feelings, and yes, feelings make you feel good, but what do you get at the end of the story? What do you learn from the end of the story? The whole goal of telling a story is to give the reader a message, or to present a message to the reader. And in the case of comics and science fiction, make a comment about society. This is what the model has always been since its inception, back in the 1930s. And people, have to learn there's a time to be a fan, and then there's a time to be a professional. And you have to put on your professional hat when you enter a professional arena such as writing and publishing. Um, what I learned many years ago, was that I had to do that. It was a tough process, but eventually I learned it was the best thing I ever could do, because I want to write the best stories possible for any character I create or any character I work with, and I want those characters to have the best story possible. And you know, I may be passionate about the stories I'm telling, but I learned, there's a time to turn my emotions off and do what is best for the story sometimes. Yes, you don't want to see the characters get hurt, but sometimes that's the only way you can grow the character and help them to become better characters so you can tell better stories later on. Um, and that's all a part of the character transformation process, because characters just don't stay one way. That's the whole interesting thing about comics, is that it's more of a circle, and that characters change, they grow in a story, but then eventually they go right back to that original point. And the whole thing is that that point is about their mission, and it always goes back to those core values within their mission. And every the character changes, they grow, and then they go back to point one, and they change and they grow, and they continue to show how this growth pattern relates to their mission. And their mission, you can only learn about their mission by, one, reading their earliest issues, and two, by doing the research and listening to what the creator said about the character, and what the creator meant when they created the character, and what type of mission that they established with the character. And that's something that a lot of people who are emotional, they're not going to dig that deep. All they're going to do is say, I read a Walt Simonson run on Thor, or a David Michelin or Bob Layton run on Iron Man. I'm gonna go with that. And yeah, that may make you might make one or two good stories, but you know, it's not gonna give you that insight into really building something lasting with this character that readers can relate to, and then go back to the root of the character and say, this really relates to this character's mission, or this really redefines this character's mission for the next generation. You really have to dig deep when you're writing an existing character like a superhero, or even creating a new superhero, because you really want to make that mission strong. Because if the mission isn't strong, then the reader's going to have a hard time relating to the character, or identifying with the character, or seeing themselves in the character, or understanding the message that you're trying to present. And that's core to a comic, is your message. Again, like with Spider-Man and the great power and the great responsibility, that's a very powerful message that was in that story, and that's one of the core tenets of his mission. Just like with Batman and his oath to protect Gotham City from criminals. Again, these are all core tenets of the characters, and all these core tenets usually get lost with people who get emotionally involved. And when you're emotionally involved, you don't pay attention to those small elements and those details. All you do is focus on the character and how you want them to look and how you want them to feel and the things you want them to say. And that's not what it's about. It's about making sure that you continue to tell stories from unique perspectives, but you stay true to the spirit and the core mission of this character, so that readers can continue to relate to them and continue to identify with them, and can continue to see what makes this character great, and what makes this character a hero. And that's something I had to learn, and that's something that I had to learn even in creating the characters like Isis or John Haynes, or recently with other characters like Nikki Desmond and Eastine. That when I create a character, I have to have that mission for them, and they have to stay really true to that mission. And even if I'm going to get creative with story models, like the recent Isis Eastine crossover, or novels like The Temptation of John Haynes, I have to make sure that the characters stay true to themselves, and they have to stay true to their mission, and that their mission and their message never get lost, no matter what type of story I'm telling. But that comes from me, learning that objective perspective, pulling myself away, even as I'm writing on the keyboard, me starting to learn how to see all the action going on from that panoramic view, and seeing these contrasting viewpoints, and seeing everything so that the reader understands, the message that I'm trying to tell, and, the perspectives I'm trying to present, and give them that, the best picture possible, so they can, come to their own observations and come to their own conclusions, but more importantly, see that message that I'm trying to present in every story. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.